Arlecchino. Okay, I will answer this later. Alright, so Arlecchino. Okay, alright. You know what? I'll answer all of these questions in this video itself to help you decide whether to pull for her or not. But before that, we need to learn everything about her so that those questions actually make sense to you all. So let's start with this complete, comprehensive, thorough, exhaustive, full, inclusive, detailed and extensive guide for Arlecchino, and I promise you that once you see this video, you will have no doubts whatsoever regarding her kit, weapons, team comms, artifacts, constellations and whatever else you can think of. But if you still have any questions after watching this video fully, then make sure to drop them down in the comments below and I'll respond to each and every one of you individually. But before we start, I would like to thank you all for the positive comments on my last video. In light of the racist comments I was getting, it really means a lot and I just wanted to let you know that I really appreciate that. With that being said, Arlecchino is a Pyropolam user who has an HP based mechanic with a panic heal on burst who relies on normal attack talent to deal damage. Wait a minute. That's just who?
We don't see that here.
Okay, alright. No need to get violent. So, Arlecchino is everything I just said and definitely not Hu Tao. So, before we start understanding her kit, I would like to mention two things before we start. First is the Bond of Life mechanic, which is the red thingy around your HP bar that needs to be healed first before healing the actual character themselves. And the more Bond of Life Arlecchino has, the more damage she is doing. Second thing is her general rotation, which starts off with her elemental skill, followed by a burst, skill again, swapping to your supports and dropping their abilities, swapping back to Arlecchino after a minimum of 5 seconds and using a charge attack, followed by a normal attack spam for 9 to 11 seconds. Now, I know most of you didn't register that, so I'm gonna have this rotation on screen while explaining her kit, cause that will make it easier to understand. Now, if you are already familiar with her kit and teams and stuff, or have seen my past videos on it, then prepare for a strong sense of deja vu. With that being said, let's delve right into it. Starting off with her skill, which deals AoE pyro damage and marks enemies with an X. And this X is essentially a dot effect or a damage over time effect. Now, what does this dot effect do? Well, it deals minor pyro damage every 5 seconds for a maximum of 2 times. But honestly, no one cares about that because her main source of damage is her pyro infused normal attacks. And how do you get those pyro infusion normal attacks? Well, you get it by using a charge attack on an enemy with the X mark on them. That charge attack will absorb the X mark on enemies, granting Arlecchino a certain amount of Bond of Life. And how much is that certain amount, you ask? Well, it depends on your combat scenario. But one interesting thing to note here about the Bond of Life indicator is that it will always be half of how much you actually have. So let's say you have 70% Bond of Life, then it will only show up as 35% of the HP bar in the indicator. And if you are wondering why not show the full 70% to avoid any confusion, right? Well, it's cause you can easily get over 100% Bond of Life every rotation. So yeah, if you had over 100% Bond of Life, then where would you even show it on the HP bar, right? That's why it's displayed as half. And now we get into the main part of our kit.
Let me try my blade.
So let's consider a scenario where you are fighting a single enemy. The battle starts off with Arlecchino's skill, which deals damage to the enemy and marks them with X. And this X mark has 2 levels, with the second level giving you more Bond of Life. So when X is at level 1, which is immediately after using a skill, of course, it will give you 65% Bond of Life. But if you wait for 5 seconds, X will be upgraded to level 2, and at that point it will give you 130% Bond of Life. Now, let's consider a scenario with 2 enemies, and this is where things get interesting. So, the battle starts off with a skill which applies the X mark on all enemies within a certain radius. Now, even at level 1 X, if you do a charge attack, Arlecchino will absorb both of those X's and get 130% Bond of Life. Because for each X absorbed, she'll get 65% Bond of Life, and 65 plus 65 equals 130. But let's just say that instead of immediately absorbing the X, you wait for 5 seconds for it to get to level 2 and then use a charge attack. Then how much Bond of Life do you think you'll get? If your answer was 260% cause 130 from each X, then you aren't exactly wrong in thinking that, but you lack critical info. And what is that critical info? Well, you can only gain a maximum of 145% bond of life per skill cast. So even though absorbing both X's should give you 260% bond of life, it will only give you 145% cause that is the limit set on her skill. Now let's consider a scenario with 3 enemies. You use her skill on them, applying the X mark on them, and then immediately use a charge attack. Then how much bond of life do you think you will have? If you answered 145, then congrats, you understood her core mechanic. But if your answer was 195, because you thought that absorbing 3 X's should give you 65 plus 65 plus 65, which is 195 bond of life, then let me say it again. Her max limit is 145% per skill cast. So if you understood everything I have said so far, then you would have realized that waiting 5 seconds in a multiple enemy scenario is pretty much useless, because you can get 145% bond of life immediately after casting her skill. But in a team, you will obviously switch to different characters and use their abilities, which will take 5 seconds anyway. So even though you can skip the 5-second wait, you won't really be doing that. Now, let's consider a scenario where an enemy dies while having the X mark on them. In that case, regardless of who killed that enemy, Arlecchino will gain 130% bond of life, and the rest of the enemies will still have the X mark applied on them, which can be absorbed by Arlecchino's charge attack to reach the max cap of 145. And if you have been enjoying the video so far, then a sub to the channel would be Prolific. Moving on to her burst, which is essentially an AoE nuke that heals Arlecchino as well as resets the skill cooldown. And why is that important? It's cause during battle, Arlecchino can't be healed by anyone but herself. So how does this healing work? Well, let's say that the enemy has X applied on them and you do your burst. Then the burst will absorb that X, granting Arlecchino bond of life, and then immediately heal her for 150% of the bond of life she has plus 150% of her attack. Now, in that 150% bond of life I mentioned, 100% of that will be used to clear up the bond of life you already have, and the remaining 50% along with 150% of attack is the amount of healing Arlecchino will actually receive. And finally, we have her normals, which are her main source of damage. So starting from the top of her rotation, once again the battle starts with her elemental skill, which marks enemies with X, followed by her burst, which absorbs the X mark from enemies and heals Arlecchino as well as resets the skill cooldown. Then you skill again to reapply the X mark, swap to your support and drop their abilities, swap back to Arlecchino after a minimum of 5 seconds and use her charge attack to absorb that X and gain 130% bond of life. And as soon as Arlecchino gets over 30% bond of life, she gains a pyro infusion. But this infusion is semi-permanent. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you have over 30% bond of life and the pyro infusion, then as long as you aren't using your attacks to hit enemies, your pyro infusion will remain. But if you are attacking enemies, then each attack will consume 7.5% of the current bond of life you have. And that's why I say it's semi-permanent, because in the open world, if you finish a battle with over 30% bond of life, then you will have the pyro infusion until you use it in another battle or eat food to heal. Another effect associated with her normals is that each hit decreases the skill cooldown by 0.8 seconds. So now that we know that each attack consumes 7.5% of the current bond of life, it means that at 130 bond of life, you can do a maximum of 19 hits before the infusion runs out, which is 3 normal attack cycles in approximately 13 seconds. But on average, you should be spamming normal attacks for 9 to 11 seconds, after which the skill cooldown would have finished resetting the skill and the support buffs would also have expired, after which you repeat the entire cycle. But this is where another interesting playstyle of hers comes into play. So at this state, after finishing the previous rotation, you will have an approx 40 to 50% bond of life remaining. Now, you can either choose to use her skill and burst to heal and clear that bond of life, but you can also choose to not use her burst, instead only using her skill, swapping to supports and using their abilities, swapping back to Arlecchino after a minimum of 5 seconds and using a charge attack to gain an additional 130% bond of life on top of the 40% you already had, resulting in 170% bond of life. And that's why, even while explaining her skill before, I said that the 145 bond of life limit is per skill cast. So when you use a skill again and already have bond of life from before, it isn't counted in the new 145 cap, meaning you can even go up to 200% bond of life if you want. And keep in mind that 200% is the max bond of life you can achieve. Having said that, is that extra 40% bond of life worth not using the burst? Cause I'll be honest, burst actually does decent damage. So in my opinion, yes. And what do I mean by that? Well, for most players, bursting will be essential to prevent them from dying and in turn do more damage. Whereas for a god gamer who can dodge everything, bursting will be a DPS loss since they don't require that healing and you can make use of the remaining bond of life from one rotation in the next rotation. And like I said in the beginning, the more bond of life you have, the more damage Arlecchino is doing. So 200% bond of life will result in higher damage than the regular 130 bond of life. So that's why even though not using the burst might be beneficial, it is more so dependent on how you play. Alright, moving on to her weapons, and to no one's surprise, her signature is obviously the best in slot. In fact, it is a super niche weapon that some people have dubbed as being the first nihility HSR weapon in Genshin, since its passive is literally about extra bond of life and you getting more damage from that. And as of right now, Arlecchino is the only character to have bond of life mechanics which can make use of that weapon. Other than the signature, Homa is a really good choice of course, but keeping its passive up will be tough unless you like living on the edge. Staff of Scarlet Sands is another good choice which is almost as good as the signature with 3 stacks. TJWS is also a good choice besides the other 5 stars I mentioned. And if you have been playing for a long time, you probably have this weapon already. But enough about these veil things. Let's talk about the 4-star weapons you can run on her, starting off with the event weapon which most people will probably have, Missive Wind Spear. That I would say is a really good weapon for her, especially in wave teams. And I'll be using that as a reference to rank other weapons. Other than this, if you have Dragon's Bane R5, then it is a decent stat streak in wave teams but slightly worse than Missive Wind Spear. Now, if you are a new player or a really unlucky one, then White Tassel would also be a really good option considering its crit rate substat along with the normal attack passive, which is really good for Arlecchino since her main source of damage are her normals. The full list of her weapon rankings is displayed on screen, but keep in mind these will vary heavily based on your team compositions. Moving on to her artifacts, the new set, whose passive is literally based on bond of life, is obviously the best in slot, with 4-piece Gladiator being second. And the Gladiator set on average is around 10% worse than the signature set, but let's be honest, if you have been playing this game decently long, you already have a 4-piece Gladiator set with really good stats, so you can just yoink it off other characters and put that on her while farming for the new set if you want to. You can also run a combination of 2-piece Crimson and 2-piece attack or 2-piece attack and attack, but that's obviously bad compared to her best in slot. And as for the substats, I would recommend the standard choices: attack percent on sands, pyro damage bonus goblet, and crit rate or damage circlet depending on your crit values. You can also run EM sands in wave teams, which is like 1 to 2% better than the attack sands, and I would also recommend getting around 130 to 140 ER, after which you are
Being chilling.
So now that we understand everything about her, is she the most violent? Is she the most diabolical? Is she the most dangerous? Is she the goat of all goats and the ultimate meta breaker everyone was expecting? No, that she ain't. But she's still pretty strong, like against a single enemy. Yeah, she's stronger than Neuvillette as well. Heck, her best team can even reach rational levels of damage. For those who don't know, rational comp is one of the strongest comps in game, consisting of Raiden, Benny, Xiangling, and Xingqiu. But what holds her back is the interruption resistance issue. Cause yes, she can dish out tons of damage, but her best team has no shielders, which means that unless you are able to dodge or dash cancel every attack, you are literally getting knocked around like a volleyball. And if you are wondering why interruption to resistance is so important, it's cause it prevents you from being knocked around while dealing damage, which in razor terms translates to more damage, less volleyball. So let's discuss the teams which will enable you to reach those insane levels of damage while also discussing their viability and comfortness. Starting off with our best team, the Domimommies. This team, consisting of Kazuha, Arlecchino, Yelan and Benny, is the most premier, top-notch, elite comp you can get for insane damage. In fact, if we disregard the fact that you are getting knocked around like a football, this team can potentially do more damage than Rational. But since most players don't play like a god to prevent getting knocked around, getting that damage is really hard unless your Arlecchino is at C1, since she does gain interruption resistance through that constellation. Now, I know many people don't have Yelan, so instead you can use the -1 Domimommy comp with Xingqiu instead of Yelan, and the rotation will pretty much be the same. Now, both of these teams I mentioned focus more on damage than comfort, and to solve that issue we have the Dong and Mom comp, where instead of using Kazuha, you swap him out for Zhongli, ensuring survivability and comfort, but at the cost of some damage. And around these two teams revolves every other wave team you can possibly imagine. For instance, if you have both Yelan and Xingqiu but not Kazuha, then you can go with a team called the Wet Domimommies, consisting of Arlecchino, Yelan, Xingqiu and Benny. You can even use the Furina's Worst Nightmare comp, where you use Furina instead of Yelan, but keep in mind that gaining fanfare stacks will be kinda tough in this one since you don't really have a team-wide healer. Also, to all those who asked about Furina's fanfare working with Arlecchino's Bond of Life, I am afraid to tell you that Bond of Life changes aren't counted in fanfare stacks. Only direct HP changes contribute to that, meaning you can only gain fanfare points from Arlecchino through her burst and not Bond of Life. Now, if you don't like the idea of playing inside Benny's ultimate circle, then you can replace him with Kazuha, but in Arlecchino's case, Benny's buff will be much more significant than Kazuha's buff, so expect less damage in this team. Another interesting team comp, which is a really fun one but not necessarily a strong one, is the Infinite Bond of Life comp, where instead of using Kazuha or Benny, you use Xianyun with Furina, cause that will definitely make it easier to gain fanfare points. And if you are plunging with Arlecchino, no Bond of Life will be consumed per plunge, meaning infinite Bond of Life. But it is a double-edged sword, cause those plunge attacks won't be buffed like how the normal attacks would be, resulting in less damage. Now, all of these teams I mentioned besides the Xianyun one are pretty much the best teams you can run for Arlecchino damage-wise. And like I said before, you can do rational levels of damage with some of these teams, but where Rational and Neuvillette teams take the cake are AoE scenarios. Cause first of all, you aren't getting knocked down like a pinball in Rational or Neuvillette teams. Second, the comfort level in those teams is insane. For example, in the Rational team, you are getting insane interruption to resistance for the entire duration of Raiden's burst, and not to mention Xiangling's burst nukes enemies all around you. So yeah, that team has AoE and interruption resistance. As for Neuvillette teams, you are already attacking from a distance, meaning you getting knocked around will rarely happen. And second, his Kamehameha can literally pass through enemies, meaning you are attacking multiple enemies at once if you position yourself correctly. And for these particular reasons, those two teams are better than the best Arlecchino team. But in an ideal scenario against a single enemy, Arlecchino teams are doing the same damage as Rational, if not more. Now, whatever I have said so far doesn't mean that Arlecchino has no AoE whatsoever. No. In fact, she has quite decent AoE in her normals, which allows her to hit enemies if they are close by. And that is something you can't do with Hu Tao's Stars attack unless the enemies are in a straight line. Now let's talk about the teams which everyone was expecting her to be the best in, the Overload comps. And I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan of Overload in particular due to enemies getting knocked around and you having to constantly follow them to deal damage. It's an insane damage loss in my opinion, but I can't deny that Arlecchino Overload teams are super fun, especially with Chevreuse. Also, to those wondering if Chevreuse C6 works with Arlecchino or not, since it does rely on healing, let me tell you, it works perfectly. So you can get get that extra pyro damage bonus easily. A team like Fischl, Arlecchino, Benny and Chevreuse is one of the best overload teams, with Yai instead of Fischl being second. You can also use Beidou instead of Fischl in what will be called as the Dominatrix comp. And the interesting thing about this team is that Beidou's burst actually provides interruption resistance, which is a really good thing for Arlecchino. But unless you can Meliodas perfect counter with her, good luck getting her burst back unless you have over 300 energy recharge. So overall, I would say that you are better off running Fischl instead of Yai or Beidou, even though Beidou might be better in an AoE scenario. Cause like I said, 300 energy recharge for burst unless you are doing perfect counters. You can also run another electro unit instead of Chevreuse if you don't have her, but the damage would be less than the Chevreuse comp. Now, if you are a Lini fan, then you probably also like mono pyro comps. So we have the finally I can use Dea comp, in which you got Arlecchino, Benny, Kazuha and Dea, who provides interruption resistance, but Dea being Dea will only provide that for 6 seconds, after which you are back to getting knocked around. So I'll be honest, it's better to use Xiangling instead of Dea in this team comp, because at least you'll be doing more damage that way. And if you have been enjoying the video so far, then a sub to the channel would make father happy. Now those 3 types of teams I mentioned are the only ones I would recommend running with her. But if you are a masochist, then you can run her in other teams like Meld comps, Persian comps, or if you are a Thoma fan, then Overburn comp. And like I said before, if you don't care about maximum damage, then run Zhongli in any of the teams I mentioned and you are good to go. In fact, I would personally rate the team of Arlecchino, Benny, Xingqiu and Zhongli as number 1 due to 2 of the units being 4 stars, which everyone has, and not to mention the comfortness of that team. And if you have any questions so far, feel free to ask them in the comments and I'll respond to each and every one of you individually. Now speaking of Zhongli, I would like to shout out my friend for recommending the I am a Geo comp, which consists of Arlecchino, Xingqiu, Yunjin and Zhongli. Yunjin being there to boost normal attack damage as well as increase the attack speed if you have her C6. And speaking of Constellations, Arlecchino has some really, and I mean really insane ones, to the point where you can literally solo abyss with her at C6. And that's why I want you to look at her constellation from a perspective that each level is contributing to her becoming Sung Jinwoo or the solo god. Starting off with her C1, which increases her interruption to resistance by a lot. As an example, you can survive up to 4 Ruin Guard spin hits. And if you don't know, then Ruin Guard spin attacks is one of the strongest attacks in game, which sends all characters flying, meaning the interruption resistance you are getting at this constellation is pretty significant. Now besides this effect, her C1 also increases the damage she deals from her pyro infused normal attacks by an approx 26 to 27%, making this constellation one of the best there ever was. So this is definitely a constellation breakpoint for her and something you should consider getting if you can. Moving on to her C2, which basically makes it so that you don't have to wait for 5 seconds for the dot effect to get to level 2. Instead, it already starts off at level 2, meaning you can immediately absorb it and gain 130% bond of life. But thanks to C2, when you absorb the dot effect, you will also do an extra AoE pyro hit whose damage is slightly less than the burst. Now this constellation in a team scenario is not that good because you will be switching to different characters anyway. Moving on to her C3, which is a really good one as it increases her normal attack level by 3, and I am 50-50 on whether to call it a breakpoint or not, but I can say that this is the constellation where you, and excuse my language, start to edge. Now let's discuss C4, which is probably the most overlooked constellation in her entire kit, since it just enables you to burst more often by providing you extra energy plus a 2-second less cooldown on burst. In a team scenario, this constellation is not that great, but from a solo perspective, this is an amazing one. Moving on to our C5, which is just 3 extra levels to burst. And keep in mind, those 3 extra levels don't increase the healing you get. Instead, they only increase the damage the burst is doing. And finally, we have our C6, which is just broken, because at this point, to put it in PG terms, you aren't edging anymore like you were at C3, because your normal attack cycle is now doing an approx 85% more damage compared compared to C0 normal attack cycle. But what exactly does this constellation do, you ask? Well, it basically increases the damage of her burst by a lot and buffs normal attack by 10% crit rate and 70% crit damage, which is just insane. To give you an example, you will be casually dropping 200k to 300k waves from normal attacks. Not burst, not skill, from normal attacks. So yeah, at C6, Arlecchino, despite being a rejected descender, rises up to claim the throne from the heavens. Now, time to answer the burning question, C1 or the weapon? Well, the one-line answer to this question is weapon for damage, C1 for overall. And what do I mean by this? Well, if you can dodge perfectly, then weapon is the better choice for you since it will give you more damage. But on the flip side, not dodging because you have C1 means you are attacking continuously without wasting any time dodging. But now comes the main practicality part, which most theory crafters won't even mention. So if you have C1 and aren't getting knocked around, there is a good chance you might not even notice that you are losing HP or getting hit by someone, because there won't be a stagger effect due to the increased resistance to interruption. This will especially be the case if you play the game on mute. But if you play the game with sound enabled and pay enough attention to notice that your character's HP is getting drained without a significant stagger effect, then go for the Constellation. But if not, then go for the weapon since it is more of a damage buff than the Constellation. With that question being answered, you know what I was thinking? Right now we don't have any units which are very niche Bond of Life supports for Arlecchino, but I feel that the Pyro Archon may have something either in her passive or her Constellation which enables Arlecchino to gain even more Bond of Life or do more damage with whatever Bond of Life she has. But hey,
That's just a theory. A game